This year we've seen two games, Lords of the Fallen and Lies of P, that both attempt to take on the 3D Souls-like genre. I already did a very long review of Lords of the Fallen, which people seem to mostly enjoy, but one of the most common things that people mentioned in the comments was Lies of P, either how much better it is or how they were baffled that people would choose to praise it instead of Lords of the Fallen, which some people think is a better game. I initially hesitated to make a video on Lies of P, believing that I didn't have anything that interesting to say about it, but having now replayed the game 2 more times, I believe it's important to break down exactly why it is as good as it is. To get it out of the way, I think Lies of P is an amazing game with some absolutely brilliant design decisions. In a phrase I find myself repeating too often in my videos, it's not perfect, and I will point out its mistakes as well, but it is impressive in many ways that caught me by complete surprise. It has some exceptional progression, pacing and enemy design, spectacularly memorable bosses, a narrative that ties into gameplay in more ways than one, and all of this on a studio's first attempt at a game like it. And in something very important for this video, it understands what makes these games work and executes its fundamentals near flawlessly, while still being original in many other ways, with a unique blend of influences that range from the obvious Bloodborne to Resident Evil 4 and Bioshock. And this is precisely why it's so interesting to examine it next to Lords of the Fallen, as they truly represent two very different paths that share the same starting point. So for this video, I'm going to break down the design of Lies of P using Lords of the Fallen as a counterpoint. This does mean that my focus will be on Lies of P, since my in-depth thoughts on Lords is already available in its own video, linked in the description below. First, I will examine the design of combat and its systems and how each game takes very different approaches with very different underlying philosophies. And after that, we'll talk about enemy design, encounter design, level design, and bosses. The video itself is quite long, and you have handy chapters for easier access, and I recommend a snack and a drink for viewing. As always, if you find that the things in this video are interesting, made you think about something differently, or was just entertaining, hit the like button. It helps my videos reach more people. To start off, we need to talk about how these games are so different in their core design. Robot Pinocchio follows in FromSoft's Souls-like footsteps, especially Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, and it follows in those footsteps very closely where it matters, and innovates in many aspects that surround the core gameplay, but never modify it. There's no better example of this than looking at character movement. The speed at which you move, strafe, sprint, attack, and even the number of attacks possible with stamina breakpoints and the rhythm that these attack chains have are all very close to the Souls and Friends saga. I haven't measured frame data to come out here and say some impressive cherry-picked example of how 2 weapons are identical between this game and Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3, but I don't think that matters. Even from the footage on screen, you can clearly see how similar they are. This is why Lies of P comes off as such a polished and premium game that took many by surprise. Because as I said in my Lords of the Fallen review, good artists copy and great artists steal. But what you decide to steal is very important. P steals the most important parts that make Dark Souls successful. The movement and combat, down to the feeling of weight and momentum. The progression and some encounter design are all very much traced over from Software's blueprint, and the things they change all surround that blueprint without ever changing what sits at the center. I've seen people say otherwise in comment sections or that one website that Elon Musk owns. They'll say, "That's not true, Lies of P is completely different. You have no idea what you're talking about. What about the parry mechanic? What about P's arm and how you use it in combat? These things fundamentally changed the game." And I understand wanting to defend or overly praise a game you like, but this is not only untrue, but it's also a disservice to the game, since what it really does is even more worthy of praise. And I hate to do this, but this requires a little bit of explanation before continuing. Let's take a moment to properly define what are a game's core mechanics. since this can be a little fuzzy as it has changed over time and many people have different interpretations, so I'll limit this to my own definition. Core mechanics are the elements present in gameplay that a player needs to interact with in order to succeed or play the game. The majority of a player's experience in Lies of P revolves around moving throughout a space, encountering enemies, and engaging them in combat where you swing your weapon, avoid damage, and occasionally use other things. Changing how the parry system works or how items work, or adding an extra tool or placing more emphasis on the use of status effects does not mean that the core of the game, what you do over and over and over again in that game, changes with it. What is truly central to this game's design, those core elements, are all directly lifted from Software. And that's not a bad thing, it's very smart. Think of it this way, a player can complete all of Lies of P without ever doing a perfect guard, or ever using their Legion arm, but they can't complete it without walking, sprinting, and swinging their weapon. And this is where the biggest difference is between Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen. Lords chooses to change around many more parts of the formula, but most importantly, the core of it. For as many twists as it has regarding environmental puzzles with its world-swapping mechanic, or its laborious encounter design focused on excessive mobs, its very well-done ranged combat system, or its controversial changes to bonfires, Lords makes changes to movement and combat at its very core. Movement is very exaggerated, with minimal inputs leading to fast, slightly floaty movements. Your sprint is fast to an almost comical level. Each weapon swing tracks aggressively and moves you a fair distance. Attack strings, while still following much of the pattern set in place by Souls-likes, are all either slightly faster or contain big pauses for impact and effect, as well as having a greater emphasis on crowd control. The entire combo system that it has, which allows you to switch movesets mid-combo, is like a side grade to Bloodborne's trick weapons, and it has some success, but fails to provide meaningful reasons to swap between light and heavy attacks, since they do the same damage, unless you charge your heavies, and stagger damage is only relevant on the very rare bigger enemies, meaning the core loop of swapping between heavy and light to reach damage thresholds is not really present. It also ruins weapon diversity, since all weapons in each of the 12 classes have identical movesets. But even beyond that, Lords places a higher value on things outside of the core mechanics. While you can beat the whole game without ever using a ranged attack or a spell, the game heavily promotes that you do so, making them extremely powerful. In Lies of P, things like the Perfect Guard, the Fable Arts, or the Legion Arm are definitely useful, but the game feels like it was designed for people to be able to get through it without ever using them, whereas in Lords, ignoring some of these mechanics feels like turning on a challenge mode. But these are not bad things, because they try to change things. Lords considers that the core of Dark Souls is difficult combat encounters, doesn't matter the reason that they're difficult, and it also has to contain loot, level ups, bonfires, and animation-locked combat. Everything else is up to interpretation, and it changes things wherever it can. Lies of P, instead, considers that the core of these games lies in how they feel to play. In the speed of movement, the timing of attacks, the risk-reward present in them, the creativity and player expression around different weapons with unique properties, and the desire to pursue different builds because they look really cool instead of because they are the most optimized to take down bosses. And I have an example to show this difference, but I need you, the viewer, to really test your imagination with a bit of a thought experiment. If you took out bonfires, leveling up, loot, and the stamina that is in Lords of the Fallen and played it, you could see the inspiration from Dark Souls, but it would be considered an action-adventure game with shades of Souls games, somewhere between Souls and Jedi Survivor. If you did the same to Lies of P, it would be a clear-cut Souls-like that does away with some aspects of the formula. The difference might seem small, but it isn't. Lies of P applies changes and innovations all around that central feeling that stays so close to Souls, the opposite of what Lords attempts to do. I don't think either answer is correct. They're simply two different approaches. One is more ambitious than the other in what it needs to get right to be a really good game, and Lords simply doesn't live up to those ambitions, while Lies of P chose a path that grounds its fundamentals in the established formula. Essentially, it's gaining its footing on familiar ground and then building on top of it, and from here it will probably apply more meaningful changes in its already confirmed sequel. This also means that Lies of P can experiment to its heart's content and be praised for all of its differences to Souls games, because even if you don't like the changes, at the heart of it is still a game that plays so close in style and quality to the established formula that it's guaranteed to be a hit with a lot of people. And there are many differences, although the biggest ones will come later in the video within the enemies, levels, and bosses. For now, we're going to focus on the combat aspect, all of the things that the player has at their disposal. The most important part to remember when talking about all of these is that they are all additions to the core. They give players options, but they could all be removed and the game would still function. They of course add value to the game, but the fact that they are all optional on top of the existing very solid, very From Software gameplay is what allows the developers to spread their wings, in contrast to the decisions made by Lords of the Fallen. In what I'm unsure is a hot take or not, Lies of P gets in the way of its own innovations with weapons. Weapons themselves are a very important part of all Souls-adjacent games, and it's an area where we see a lot of different takes and innovations, even within the main series, with each new entry adding twists to weapons and attempting to make them each more distinct from one another, using different movesets, weapon art, or adding interesting properties. The one that did the most to shake up the formula was Bloodborne, which got rid of the huge lists of different weapons in exchange for a smaller amount of very unique weapons with the trick weapon system. Elden Ring went back to the standard, but continued the trend of trying to make every single weapon unique, even if they fit into general classes. Lies of P does something completely different and very clever. Something that I initially thought would be a silly gimmick, but turned out to be a huge hit. Weapons in Lies of P are combined from a handle and a blade, with the handle determining the moveset and the blade affecting weight, speed, type of damage, and range, and both of them together determine your stat scaling. This means that if you love any of the unique movesets that a handle provides, but wanted that moveset to do electric damage, or to have more range, or to deal blunt damage, or scale better with something else, these are all possible, but with certain costs associated. You can socket handles with cranks, much like gems would, to change their scaling. The blade can then further this, but placing a very long, heavy blade part on a fast attacking knife handle will make it swing considerably slower. You could also take a longer handle with a different moveset and combine it with very short blades if range is a particular problem, but the blade might have the perfect damage type, and this will affect the speed and efficiency just as you expect. This freedom in choosing your playstyle feels magnificent in multiple ways. It doubles down on something that I've said about Souls games before, that your moveset and weapon choice should ideally be about the vibe. How much you like it for whatever reason and not because of stats. I think you should always be playing the game and tailoring your build around the weapons you like to use instead of hunting for the best. And the balance of these games should account for this and allow players to do this without feeling punished. There will always be people who go to extreme lengths and optimize things, but your choice should always be viable. Now I have to add here, before people misunderstand, this doesn't mean all weapons are created equal. Some will always escape balance, including the typical cheese we see with weapons that constantly stagger, deal way too much damage, or break enemies in one way or another. That's not what I'm saying when I say equally viable. What I'm discussing is the point at which those optimizations or cheese strats are searched for. If the top 1% of players looking to speedrun the game search for these strats, that's good. If people are searching for them to take down the optional ultra-difficult boss, that's good. If normal, everyday players gravitate towards cheese builds just to play the game normally, it means that either your difficulty tuning is off, or your weapons are failing to attract players in a meaningful way. So instead of finding a weapon they love, they're simply looking for the weapon that easiest allows them to beat the game. Lies of P, in my opinion, tackles all of this masterfully. I felt like I would always find a new handle and be excited to try out the moveset and see if I liked it. I could always swap out the blade and tune the handle to fit my stats, so in the end, what I was looking for was vibing with my weapon, and I could trust that those weapons would be suitable to get through the game with. In Lords of the Fallen, for as much as I enjoy its spin on combat, the combination of all weapons being the same and the way that the levels were designed, more on that in the video specific to that game, I gravitated towards whatever weapon was objectively the strongest within what is or was the strongest build at the time. Any build that used Radiance magic. If the weapon could one-shot the annoying mobs, I valued that over it being a playstyle that I thought was cool, meaning I ended up wielding great swords for their one-shot potential, which are movesets I normally despise, and then I moved on to the dual-wielding long swords, which have a moveset that I despise, but they proved to be the strongest option for an Umbral build in that game. Did I want to pursue that Umbral build just because I wanted to? Yes, and that's a pro for Lords of the Fallen. It enticed me enough to go out of my way to try that build. But when I did, the magic was disappointing, and I had to sacrifice my weapons to fit that build, making me feel constrained. This problem isn't exclusive to Lords of the Fallen, mind you. This is something that happens in From Software's games as well, where if your starting point is your build, your weapon selection is limited. But where I often feel that build decisions in those games came down to first finding a weapon I loved and then building around it, in Lords of the Fallen, I never fell in love with any weapon. I was close and kept my hopes up all the way through, expecting that maybe the next polearm I find will change a couple of the moves that I really didn't like about the polearm moveset, but alas, that just isn't how that game works. Lies of P manages to land its idea perfectly, and offers you the flexibility to play in whatever style you love with wacky, unique, crazy ideas in it, and never limiting the player in their pursuit. But it manages to shoot itself in the foot with boss weapons. The special weapons you can obtain after defeating bosses don't use the handle and blade system, or rather they do, but you don't separate the handle and the blade. They are only available exactly as they come, but in exchange for some unique mechanics. And some of the coolest and some of the strongest weapons are in this category. You have a transforming sword that might as well be a trick weapon from Bloodborne, a spear with a very interesting and versatile moveset, a katana with a unique parry mechanic and the ability to attack while moving. You have other special weapons that focus on range, with a scythe that can extend from its pole, or a chakram that can be thrown or revved up. It's all really damn cool, and especially at launch, it was all very strong. These boss weapons can be upgraded using different materials than standard weapons, much like the special weapons in the Soul series. This is also important since Lies of P still has that small issue with collecting upgrade materials, meaning that finding an awesome weapon later on can be bittersweet. You might like it more than what you have, but you might not be able to upgrade it to the same level as your current weapon, so you just ignore it. Having a separate selection of weapons with different upgrade materials allows you to theoretically jump between the two trees and maybe farm up a surplus just in case. These boss weapons are all great. They're unique and cater to different playstyles, but they also move away from that flexibility of the normal system in the game and are more in line with traditional weapons. Is this bad? No. It still offers cool weapons that some people will love, but if you don't, there are tons of others which are modifiable. But because of this group of weapons feels special and distinct, but not in a positive way. It feels like they devalue the normal weapons, like those are lesser weapons for people who don't find their main in the cast of special ones. And more importantly, they feel like they were put in just in case people didn't like the base weapon system. I initially, especially after fighting with the transforming sword, thought that I would just have preferred if the game had all trick weapons like that one instead of the system it has. But in retrospect, that's just because I love trick weapons so damn much, and I think a lot of people do. The truth is that the base system here is creative, flexible, and rewarding. I think they should double down on it and expand it, and get rid of the weapons that don't use it or design other super weapons that fit within the normal weapon style. Or hey, they can just make trick weapons. I mean, that sword spear is awesome. I trust these devs to give us the Bloodborne 2 that we never got. And a slightly bigger change, in my opinion, are the equivalent of weapon arts, or Ashes of War, which here are called Fable arts and operate on a gauge which refills as you land hits and parries in combat. This bar is tiered, much like a fighting game bar instead of a mana bar, and each weapon's abilities are gated behind spending meter, and to keep with the handle and blade separation, each has their own art, meaning that those arts carry over when mixing and matching. My issue with this system compounds with an issue with weapon movesets, where while all of them are cool and distinct, some of them are especially limited. You often get 2, maybe 3 light attacks in your only light attack string, except for some of the faster, lighter weapons that have longer strings, which is quite normal, things like daggers. Sometimes you get 2 heavy attacks, maybe 3, and you get a running attack, and sometimes a unique attack out of a dodge. They don't lead to different strings, mixing light and heavy doesn't do anything special, and they can feel underwhelming. These weapon arts could fix a lot of that, but they can be used very rarely, unless you're playing perfectly or building specifically around them. And even then, depending on the cost of the arts for that weapon, you might only use them twice in the course of a boss fight, or 2 to 3 times over a long level section between 2 checkpoints. I think balancing here should have gone more towards reducing the resource cost or increasing the generation, whatever route they prefer. But the final result should be much more constant uses of these. The other option would be to make some of the movesets more complex, but that's a tricky thing to do as well. Bloodborne added so much depth to combat, not only by making weapons a 2-in-1 affair, but by allowing people to transform weapons mid-string. It also gave unique attacks when entering into a string from a transformation attack, or from a run, or from a dodge, leading to creative combos where you can float in and out of transformed states. Elden Ring empowers creativity more by giving you the traditional option to one-hand or two-hand a weapon, but it also added jumping into the mix, along with equipping 2 weapons and power stancing, which adds a third moveset that utilizes 2 weapons in the same class. And on top of all of this, Elden Ring also has Ashes of War, which are more accessible at any time and can be constantly used in combat. I'm not saying that what Lies of P has is bad, but it sometimes left me wanting a bit more. My favorite weapon in the game, Proof of Humanity, is a scissor sword, a concept I've loved since Kill la Kill. It's a very strong weapon, obtained by defeating the final boss of the true ending, which is completely optional. I would consider it kind of equivalent to Millennia in Elden Ring. But this sword has 2 light attacks, and 2 heavy attacks that split the blade in 2. It has a heavy and a light running attack, and 2 charged heavy attacks. That is it. That is the entire moveset. I just wish there was a bit more than 2 attacks and the Fable art to get the 2 blades in 1 fantasy going, especially since there is no dual wielding option in Lies of P. In this genre, every tiny addition to a moveset adds exponential depth for players. While Lies of P follows more of Bloodborne's philosophy, where one-handing and two-handing aren't a thing, it doesn't compare in depth here, and Fable arts could have helped. But they really don't. They feel like super moves that you can use as a panic button. The result for me was that I found myself wanting to change weapons more often than other games in the genre. I mean, just to spice it up and keep variety high. And for every great variation in opponents, it only made the limitations of my moveset sting more. I believe that while it can be a nightmare from a balancing perspective, and it multiplies the amount of work necessary, even adding 1 or 2 additional moves to weapons can have an enormous impact on player expression and keeps me more engaged for longer on each weapon I end up using. Different attacks or even potential strings that come from side dodges or back dodges, charged attacks that lead into different strings of charged attacks, and there is even potential in the genre to incorporate moves that are more technical, like using back and front inputs combined with attacks, much like kicks work in the FromSoft games, or how Stinger and High Time work in Devil May Cry, if you know about those. But hey, maybe that's just a little bit too much for the genre, what would I know? At the end of the day, compared to its peers, I think that what's on offer here varies greatly from weapon to weapon, but is overall too little. What is clear is the design philosophy in weapons, which is the opposite of Lords of the Fallen. Where I criticized Lords for its 12 different movesets with no changes between different weapons in each class, But I did praise those 12 movesets for being generally well designed for the game they're in, and I really appreciated the ability to combine those one-handed and two-handed light attacks and heavy attacks and have everything flow together with a lot of control and options. I must praise Lies of P for offering such a diverse arsenal of weapons that each feels distinct from the other, but have to criticize how shallow some of those movesets can feel. I overall prefer the design of P, because ultimately, I think the excitement you get from finding a new weapon is integral to these sorts of game. Even more heightened here, since you could put your super upgraded blade into a new handle and get a whole new moveset. And I don't think that the movesets are a bit deeper is a worthy price to pay to just strip that entire aspect from a game. But this should never be an either-or situation. I'm hopeful that the sequel to Lies of P will expand on the options the player has with each weapon, but it will be interesting to see what Lords 2, if that game happens, which I hope it does, can do in their evolution. I can see a world where doubling down and making weapon types the same amongst themselves all over again could be palatable if those movesets are expanded, much like Nioh does. But also Nioh is kind of a character action game, especially with its upgrades and unlockable moves. But anyways, you get what I'm trying to say. Something more in that direction could still work great, but maybe instead they keep the same complexity level they have at the moment and choose to make each weapon more distinct. I do want to talk about something that might be a bit spicy. Lies of P offers a training ground at your hub where you can test stuff out on dummies, and I think this is a great feature, and it even makes sense contextually in the world. I think it'd be nice if within the training area there was a lab of some sort, which allowed me to test different cranks and upgrade weapons to max levels just to see and test out their damage and scaling before committing resources to it. And I think this could work in any game that follows the Souls-like template. I know for a fact that I'm not alone in spending too long farming materials to upgrade a weapon just so that it does less damage than I thought, and ultimately deciding I like my current one more, or scouring online forums for detailed stats or videos on YouTube. None of that is truly fun, and while we understand the gamble we take when we do it, if we leave disappointed, the hours spent farming and testing the weapon didn't add value to the game or make the player feel like it was better. So adding options like these would simply streamline the process of players unsure if their weapon choice and possibilities are what they want. They would still have to go out and farm the materials for the build, but now they'll do it excited at what they're getting at the end instead of a little hesitant as to if it'll be as powerful as they hope. Again, this might be spicy, but it's just some food for thought, and similar things could be applied to my other big love in gaming, Monster Hunter. But as I said, all of this doesn't change how the core of the game works. It changes how you think about weapon selection and finding weapons, but not the act of swinging them around. Another important difference are perfect guards, which are done by pressing the block button just before an attack connects. Perfect guards work like Street Fighter Third Strike parries, with them negating all damage, but they also inflict posture or stagger damage to the enemy, which can lead to fatal attacks, while normally guarding will have you take chip damage that is recoverable, much like the rally system in Bloodborne. A decision that is identical to Lords of the Fallen, by the way. This is a cool twist to balance defense and offense, meaning it's still much more offensively focused than a normal Dark Souls, but not as balls-to-the-wall, all-out manic rush as Bloodborne could encourage at times. Especially before we all memorized every pattern in that game, am I right? No? Maybe that's just me? Okay. But it doesn't change the core of the game, and the game seems very much balanced around players dodging and blocking, not perfect guarding. Many of the harder bosses become easier if you approach them with the idea of dodging. And something we'll talk more about later when tackling those bosses, they all have attacks with easier timing that seem intended for players to perfect guard and get a feel for it, and trickier ones that are meant to be dodged. And of course, you can just dodge all of them, or if you're good enough, you could perfect guard all of them. But it accommodates both things very clearly. So once again, this system tweaks the tempo of the game, but in ways that are still well within the usual for a From Software type game. It's another addition, but not a change to the core mechanics. The Legion arm is another mechanic which adds an extra button to the game. The Legion arm that P has for a left arm can be customized to many different things, from status effect infliction to long-range attacks and trap setting, defensive maneuvers, or gap closing. And while it's all cool that this is incorporated by default, meaning that everybody has access to it and whatever option you choose from the different arms is always available to you, many of these things are existing concepts for the formula. It's just that now they've been given to you as something you don't need to spec into nor build around. But many of these options have existed within different weapons and spells in other games, and none of them really change the core of it, because if they did, the balance would be destroyed. Whatever arm is the most transformative and changes the gameplay loop would be the one that everybody needs to use. And this is all without mentioning that the very concept of a transforming arm that can be customized for different utility or offensive purposes was the entire hook, pun intended, in Sekiro, something that I rarely see mentioned, as if Sekiro is disappearing from collective memory. I'll also briefly mention that Sekiro features a stagger system that rewards you for landing perfect parries, and it rewards you by reducing a bar that represents the enemy's posture, and when you break it, you can deal big damage. It's just the same as Lies of P, except that in Lies of P the bar is hidden, and it's more designed to be a reward for mastering the game instead of a core mechanic. And these are just some of the more noticeable ones. Everything within Lies of P feels carefully cribbed or modified to fit the vision of the developers. Weapon durability is a big thing in this game, but sharpening and repairing it is always available with no resource cost or backtracking required. There are mechanics like status effects that can degrade your weapon, and if it ever fully breaks, you can't sharpen it from there. It's broken and you have to reach a checkpoint. You have to rest at a bonfire for you to fix it, meaning that you have to pay close attention or carry a backup weapon. I thought this would be annoying, but it really didn't bother me in the end. It kind of became second nature and an additional challenge. You map out boss fights with good opportunities to sharpen in mind, and you can break enemy weapons through perfect guards as well, doing the same thing to them, which is just awesome if a little bit simplified here. The idea of breaking enemy weapons could be really badass if further explored. But again, this doesn't change the core of the game. The final and one of the best examples of adding things to a formula without changing how it works fundamentally is the P organ. Yes, so very funny, P organ. But this is a mechanic with a separate upgrade tree for P that allows you to unlock different things by completing nodes on a skill tree. And to complete each node, you must spend quartz, which is dropped by bosses or obtained in side quests and exploration. Each quartz lets you choose from a list of different potential upgrades, and with enough of these slotted into a node, the larger node upgrade is unlocked, and this keeps progressing, with even further nodes being saved for New Game Plus, which we'll talk about later. The game can't hide anything too impactful here for the sake of balance, although some things border on that, with increasing your pulse cells, which are your Estus flasks in this game, or even an ukemi, which allows you to get up faster after being knocked down, being very impactful. But it does a great job of letting you tailor your upgrades to your playstyle, be that more of a focus on consumables, or on doing perfect guards, or on helping you with your dodges. If you, for example, dislike the weapon durability mechanic, you can improve durability through the P organ. If you only want to perfect guard everything, you can improve the stagger damage that your perfect guard does, and so on for a lot of things. Nothing here is too crazy, but enough to feel meaningful and like you are choosing what you want to focus on. But when talking about differences, the biggest one is obviously its setting and its overall tone. So onwards we go to everything that isn't related to what the player can do. And in this aspect, I think Lies of P is a surprising triumph that nobody really expected pre-release. The idea of exploring inanimate objects' sentience and humanity, which is a common sci-fi trope, but explored in this clockwork gearpunk setting framed around Pinocchio puppets, is just damned wild. But for as wild as it is, it could have been exceedingly dumb if not handled properly. And here, at least in mood and tone, it definitely is for my money. So let's talk enemies and level design, but before that, a quick reminder that if you're enjoying the video, hitting the like button has a lot more impact than you imagine. It helps this video reach more people, and just like subscribing, that's right there next to the like button, it helps this channel grow. Just the fact that you're watching this video means so much to me, but if you want to go above and beyond, remember to hit the buttons. In my Lords of the Fallen review, I heavily criticized the lack of inspiration and variety within the levels, and even more did I criticize the lack of enemy variety. For Lies of P, I couldn't find a specific number for the number of enemies. All of the wikis seem incomplete, and that's already telling, with even enemies that appear to be reskins having meaningful differences in how they attack you, and therefore how you approach them. More importantly, Lies of P doesn't utilize its bosses as standard enemies, which is something that leads Lords to have this strange enemy balance, where 90% of it is fighting these standard enemies, and then there's a 10% of fights that are against those mini-bosses that now have been turned into normal enemies. In Lies of P, all of the enemies are utilized more often, with some specific enemies locked into their own areas to fit thematically, but all of them being used more overall. This means it's more dynamic and keeps you learning new patterns for new enemies, and then perfecting yourself against them. On top of that, the narrative the game wants to tell around humanity, puppets, and the magic essence that exists between them gives the game the perfect twist. Enemies can be divided into three major factions: the puppets, the carcasses, and the ergo-infected. This is very similar to Lord's division between Radiance, Fire, and Umbral, by the way. But the big twist in Lies of P is that while the game starts off with a progression of puppets and then carcasses, it then slowly infects the carcasses to become ergo-infected, fitting in with the story, but it changes these enemies. It then does this with the puppets as well, infecting them with organic elements, tendrils that accompany their attacks, or more erratic patterns. It has enemies that are basically purely corrupted humans or beasts, and it keeps blending all the types of enemies together. And by the end of the game, not only are you fighting all three factions in different arrangements, but there are even humans that have been blended with puppets, giving enemies prosthetics. It's a brilliant decision that means that even if an enemy is very familiar, and at its core is an enemy you've been fighting since the start, each time they show up again, they have an additional twist. When you factor this into the already large variety of enemies in each group, it feels like, except the first few levels, you're constantly encountering new enemies and twists on old ones, as the previously distinct zones of the world also begin to merge. And when it wants to, it can even still pull back and give you only normal puppets, as it does in the Barren Swamp for a while. Enemy variety, design, and how they fit into the world is a masterclass, and leagues beyond the by comparison simplistic style of design found in Lords of the Fallen, which, despite having these three distinct factions, never finds a way to meaningfully blend them throughout the playthrough, except for that one enemy that is both holy and fire. The most impressive part of the enemy design becomes apparent if you run through the game in New Game Plus, or you try to speedrun it. If you just mainline the game without exploring the side quests and optional rooms, you'll encounter a lot of unique enemies, and a lot of enemies that are used 2 to 3 times. They aren't bosses, and they aren't really presented as mini-bosses either, they're just there. From a random strong puppet to the bear in the woods, the mutated bear in the woods, the 2 different morphing carcass giants, the horned carcass guy in the woods. And there's so many of them, and some of them that are used very sparingly, like the spider puppet and the sailor puppet at the opera house, become one-offs when just running through the game like this. There's just so many of these unique encounters. It's a staggering amount of variety. It feels like every single encounter in the game offers something new and unique. Some of these one-offs are scary and break the rule of introducing an enemy and getting to learn it before moving on, but they offer surprises, and many of them follow similar movesets to others but slightly tweaked. Not only that, but some of them are very much mini-bosses, even if they don't feel like it. You know, they don't get their big health bar on screen or anything. One of my favorite progression systems in Souls-likes is the permanently despawning enemy. Big enemies that once defeated never come back. So practically speaking, they work as a shortcut. since both in pacing and resources you can now go through the area with this threat permanently gone. Lies of P understands how to use this and understands how to play with your expectations as well. Early on, many unique enemies behave this way, but later on you'll encounter enemies that are clearly a cut above the rest and might even be unique in the area, but they do respawn, telling you, the player, no, you have to get good at this fight because you're doing it many times over. And this is all without mentioning encounter design at all, where lords will famously just throw those big menacing enemies along with 4 or 5 other ones, or 10 of them. Lies of P will sometimes, but rarely, mix enemies into bigger fights with more threats, although always much more manageable than lords, making those fights fair. But it just uses the standards we're familiar with. You will fight a big threatening enemy in isolation. Later on, they might be accompanied by 2 fodder enemies you have to dispatch first. Then they will use the enemy in isolation, but after a series of difficult previous encounters to test your nerve at beating a gauntlet. Other times they'll just throw in that 1v1 again, but they'll change the elemental type or the weapon that the enemy uses. It keeps you on your toes and helps keep you engaged by keeping variety high and threats real, meaning that you must learn enemies to truly master the game and progress at a quick pace. It's just really damn good. I've seen people criticize the mobs and the bigger fights in Lies of P, saying that they are either just as good or just as bad as in Lords. You are a hypocrite, is what they say to me, which is a really strange thing to say and clearly shows bias towards simply wanting to defend Lords of the Fallen. So I'm going to break down and explain why mobs in Lies of P are well done versus Lords of the Fallen. But first, I really need to clarify this again, since many people just don't seem to understand it. I do not hate Lords of the Fallen. I am disappointed by it. I am confused by many of its decisions, and I would love for it to be amazing. I would never make an hour-long video to say that a game is just bad. I made it because I like so many things about it and the potential that it holds. I admire how it tries to be different to other Souls-likes and how it experiments with new ideas and modifies core features. But the price that comes with experimentation is that you often encounter failure. And some of those failures can be, in my opinion, caused by a fundamental misunderstanding of what is good design and what makes people have fun in a video game. I will always praise innovation, but I won't give out cookies just because you do it. I'll applaud the effort, but will always criticize and give feedback because my role here is the pursuit of great games. Not all my opinions or analysis may hit the mark, but I do them out of love for games and the desire that they improve, not to tear them down for the memes and internet clout. In all honesty, screw that. I would love for this channel to grow, and I would love to make more content, but I will always follow my same North Star. I want to fairly break down and analyze games in entertaining ways that are constructive, not destructive. Having said that, Lords of the Fallen's mob system is horrible. It's a travesty. It borders on insulting. And Lies of P will help me explain why, with a little help from my good friend Bloodborne. There are 3 very important parts to designing encounters with mobs, so let's run through them. The first is compartmentalization, a fancy $10 word to say how sectioned off something is. If mob encounters can bleed into other encounters that are designed for one-on-one combat or for other more discrete encounters, they can become overwhelming in ways that aren't intended, or if it's intended to be possible, are ill-advised, discouraged, or a punishment. Lords of the Fallen doesn't have compartmentalization because of how the Umbral system works, which constantly spawns mobs to hound the player as long as you're in Umbral, and it turns every encounter like this into a badly compartmentalized one. This compartmentalization also governs if you are capable or not of tackling this big group of enemies one by one without all of them going crazy and trying to kill you. The second part is predictability. If the more mob-like grunt enemies are highly predictable, clearly in view of you, with heavily telegraphed attacks, for example, these become more like spectacle fights with the potential for the player to flex their area of effect attacks. This isn't something black and white though, there's a spectrum. But mostly through AI, you can make sure that mobs of enemies don't all constantly attack. In the case of Lords of the Fallen, not only do they constantly attack, but they will do so at very off timings, meaning that avoiding one enemy can lead you to unavoidable damage from another. This is tremendously unrewarding. It makes players feel like their reaction, which was to dodge with the correct timing, is now punished. It also combines this with a camera that sometimes just doesn't work, and enemies that can attack you from off-screen, combined with other enemies that are maybe off-screen doing ranged attacks. The third piece of the puzzle is tools. Bloodborne's rally system is a great example of this. In Bloodborne, getting surrounded by a mob of fodder enemies can take a big chunk of damage, but it doesn't feel nearly as bad unless you die. And that's because breaking free of that mob, reacting to it, and a couple of good hits on all of these enemies will mostly or fully recover all of your health, meaning that your reaction is more of a "stupid mob, screw you," and then you're back to full HP. It alleviates much of the pressure that mobs put on you, but it doesn't eliminate the threat, and can even be used as a strategy in facing them, where you decide to tank damage knowing you'll recover that. In Lords of the Fallen, when mobs are unfair, there's no counterplay, there's no silver lining, there's no comeback. It's just a shitty experience. Now let's look at Lies of P. For compartmentalization, there is no umbral mechanic in Lies of P, obviously. There's no constant mobs spawning from the ether to screw over otherwise fun encounters, and the game isn't designed like Lords of the Fallen is, all around these very big mob encounters. But the important part about this in Lies of P is that most encounters with mobs are clearly sectioned off, and if you ran through them, there are very clear leash ranges, which is the distance at which an enemy deactivates and stops chasing you, or there are clear barriers like ladders, drops, or doors that stop mobs from chasing you forever. The most important thing here is that Lies of P wants you to take on enemies one by one. So if you are going into an area with a lot of enemies, if you approach them in the right order, you can take them on individually. In Lords of the Fallen, it is designed in such a way that you will sometimes enter a room and be immediately attacked by 7 people. And Lords of the Fallen doesn't care that 4 of them are just unreachable at the moment and that you could easily die in the middle of it and then spawn into Umbral so that you have 12 people. When it comes to predictability, it varies, but mostly mobs are designed to be punishing in Puppet Land. They are intended for you to take them on strategically. And if you ever let them get the upper hand, they can be very punishing. But even then, they're considerably more passive and telegraphed than in Lords, where enemies will just relentlessly flail themselves onto you with no rhyme or reason. This means that even in the worst situations in Lies of P, the ones that are meant to punish you, you feel like there's always a way out and a path that would lead to victory, as the enemies surround you and take clearly defined actions. They will take step backs to prepare for an attack, or they will slowly surround you in different ways, and it's all easy to read. And when it comes to tools, Lies of P doesn't really give you many, because its intention is never to have you openly face hordes, but to strategically counter them. And this is an invisible design element that's very important. If you happen to use a weapon that excels at wide sweeps, you can use it to group up enemies on purpose and take them down. But the game isn't designed around this idea. Most weapons are precise, with limited range, and even the simplest grunt enemies take spacing into account with their behavior, clearly telling the player that the intended way to tackle these encounters is to choose what enemies in what order to take out, which, surprise surprise, is mostly how Dark Souls and Friends do it. Lords gives you the tools to deal with giant mobs, either because the combat was designed this way and the mobs were put in to take advantage of it, or because mobs were always the plan, so moves needed to be designed around them. Chicken or the egg type of jazz. But even if you give players the tools, if you fumble other aspects, it can still quickly devolve into unfair situations that don't feel rewarding. And that's before we take into consideration how designing tools around mobs affect everything in the game, that aren't mobs. So no, these two games are not at all comparable in their approaches to this. I'm sorry. But finally, let's talk about level design, an area where I feel Lies of P hits its highest highs and like one low, more or less. As I said before talking about its setting and overall style, there's a lot to unpack here. The biggest surprise for me was that beyond the Bloodborne or the Nier influences that you might spot on the surface, there's a lot of shades of Resident Evil, especially 2 and 4, as well as Bioshock here. There's a very unique blend of influences, all coated with some excellent polished graphics, and at least for me, a rock-solid performance with no crashes. But the overall design of levels is very different from Souls, and I would argue that it is this game's biggest departure from the series that inspires it. Where Souls games, even since Dark Souls, have been about presenting very open spaces that connect organically, Lies of P has sensibilities that seem more rooted in mid-2000s game design, but not in a bad way. This is going to take some effort, but I promise it will make sense. In Dark Souls, there's a very common through line in design. While there are many areas that could be considered hallways which connect different distinct areas, it has always been an essential part of the series' identity to never make these areas feel like transitory spaces, and make them shine just as much as anything else, specifically by making them big open playgrounds and frequently blurring the line between what feels like a level designed for the player to traverse towards a destination and the levels that make up those destinations. And this is that aspect of Souls-likes that drinks the most from Metroidvanias and Zelda, where areas can crisscross over more open areas and lead to different ends and odds while reconnecting to the main hub and sometimes connecting those different areas or even those different hubs together. And I think this is one of the many reasons why Dark Souls 2 is often criticized, since it sometimes masks these things way less, or sometimes doesn't mask them at all. To give more concrete examples, Central Yharnam and Cathedral Ward feel like big, large places to explore, which lead to different locations, even if in reality their purpose is to offer paths to destinations. Old Yharnam, by contrast, feels more like a traditional level leading up to a conclusion. Anor Londo could be seen as a straightforward path towards Guinevere, but even there, plenty of side rooms, quests, and of course, the entire painted world of Ariamis all exist to make it feel like more than a series of steps in reaching an ending. This is a constant. In Dark Souls 3, the Road of Sacrifices, Farron Keep, Lothric Castle, all of these show this approach off, with it culminating in the painted world of Ariandel, the prototype of what we'd see in Elden Ring, which, debatably to a better or worse result, takes this and applies the design to an open world. Lords of the Fallen feels more like a game that emulates Souls design while landing on Dark Souls 2 for a big portion of it. This isn't a knock on the game, by the way. There are many things to love about Dark Souls 2, but that's a different discussion for a different day. Lies of P kind of just doesn't follow the same principles in design. It still offers plenty of side paths, shortcuts, and slight exploration in optional rooms, but not areas. There's one side area. Everything else is simply small puzzle rooms or slight detours with an additional combat encounter to access a chest. But most of what's here is very linear. There's a critical path with very few detours or some very light exploration puzzles peppered in, but nothing to really get lost in that exploration. It's a decidedly more focused game, and don't confuse focus with better. It just means that it doesn't offer as many opportunities for players to get off the beaten path and search for stuff. It does have that openness within these concrete levels. They feel like small boxes that you thoroughly explore, but as I said, they remind me more of things like Resident Evil 4 and Bioshock than the bigger open-ended exploration of the Souls series. Krot Central Station on both visits feels like this. It's a logical place that should exist, an architecturally coherent space that you must navigate in order to reach the other side. And these explorations of locations can have other paths to explore, but they always feel like really cool levels. but not much like big open spaces. The Workshop Union, Opera House, Lorenzini Arcade, Grand Exhibition, and Barren Swamp all follow this, even the Swamp, which is the most open of all of these. It still feels clearly separated into sections in a way that harkens back to old school sensibilities, and I kind of love it. By contrast, many other locations feel very much like hallways to the next area, some of them being smaller sections within levels like in the Archabbey, the Cathedral, or the Malum district, and others being the entire level like the Path of the Pilgrim, Rosa Isabel Street, or the Collapse Streets. Then there are just wild cards, especially as I felt the Resident Evil influence kind of creep up more with the combination of some sections of the Barren Swamp and the Hermit's Cave, as well as the Relic of Trismegistus. Many of these levels have very specific vibes to them, even if some of them echo images of other games. Vibes that I personally, in a very subjective way, love. I do think that, very similar to Lords, Lies of P starts off on the worst foot, with the earlier levels being the least impressive, and the game really picking up after the Workshop Union and Vanini works. The entire stretch from the Malum district into Rosa Isabel, the Opera House, Lorenzini Arcade, the Grand Exhibition, the Swamp, and the Ruined City is a masterful stretch of hit after hit, with the Lorenzini Arcade, parts of the Swamp, and especially the second visit to the train station being just dripping with atmosphere and highly memorable images that get seared into your brain. There is an attention to detail in environmental storytelling and building an ambiance that is marvelously achieved. One of my very personal complaints about the game is how dark it is. I would have to lock myself in darkness to even see the game, since any light would produce glares on my screen when playing on a mini LED HDR monitor. But that's also one of my favorite parts of it. The game progresses through 2 nights and 2 days, which helps in giving each area a more unique look and stand out in memory chronologically. The oppressive hostility of some areas at night, making you double take at corners, scared something will jump out, is one of the truly unique parts of the game, and one of the reasons it reminds me more of Bioshock and Resident Evil. While many Souls games, by FromSoft or otherwise, flirt with the horror genre, and Bloodborne did so more overtly in the Old Hunters DLC, Lies of P takes it one step further. The parts that bring Bioshock to mind are, of course, the look at what seems like a utopic city of the future, incorporating grand technology that is now collapsing, and you're exploring it throughout its collapse. The crazed puppets and corrupted humans turning feral as they shriek and howl to hunt you down. Many of the side quests have you experiencing stories of loss, as what seems so perfect on the surface leads to puppet and human romances gone sour, stories of greatness like the opera singer Adelina and her eventual downfall, and the outright tragedies of small personal stories that become your own. As a drizzle begins to fall and you explore a now abandoned train station, you can read letters and newspapers chronicling Krat's descent into chaos, as monsters lurk the halls and only the dim light of your lamp reflects off the pools of waters that form beneath you, and the ominous growls of beasts are obscured by the sound of rain. Its Resident Evil connection can be felt much more up front. The townspeople, which greet you with hostility in the woods as dusk falls over the autumn-colored trees, the grandiose Cathedral Frangelico, and the Archabbey have this blend of impossibly grand and defiantly dark. There's a lot of imagery that evokes memories of Capcom's Saga, with the mix of stone and wood in the deep dark of the forests, the cavernous hallways of Hermit's Cave, and the treacherous cliffs and scaffolding in the barren swamp, among others. It's not that Lies of P is the first game to do these environments, and a case can be made that From Software have taken inspiration from many places as well. But there's a combination present in the imagery, the atmosphere, and the enemy designs that bring me back to one of my favorite games ever, while still retaining inspiration and not outright theft. I've been surprised that at least up to now, I haven't seen anyone comment on these similarities, given how much we love in the video game space to recall great classics, with the Dark Souls of whatever being such a meme, but I truly felt a not tenuous line that connects these games directly to P's puppet strings. The biggest resemblance to Resident Evil 4 is not aesthetic though, it's in design. New Game Plus in Lies of P lets you play with new weapons, upgrade beyond the limits of the original game, even unlocking new upgrades for the P organ. But the biggest difference is how you can breeze through the game in probably around 5 hours if you're ignoring side quests. This brisk pace, zone to zone, new enemies all of the time, highlighted by set pieces, reminds me so much of speedrunning Resident Evil 4 when I was a kid. I must have beat RE4 on PS2 at least 40 times, and if I were younger and didn't make YouTube videos that require a lot of time, I could see myself doing something similar with this game. This feeling of a first playthrough that is considerably longer, very involved, and with a lot to love, that then becomes a fast-paced, enjoyable romp on repeat playthroughs, and that the game incentivizes you to do so with other changes that I won't spoil, is what reminds me most of those old-school sensibilities. There's a quality to a game that can be beaten in a long afternoon just for fun, as well as the amount of self-imposed challenges that you could do. Weapons and builds never overstay their welcome if you just do a 5-hour playthrough with them, and they remain enjoyable, meaning you want to do it all over again with a new one. It's refreshing and one of the best parts about Lies of P, and I expect it'll have a great speedrunning community as well. Now, I won't really compare art between the two games, since that is about as subjective as you can get. What I will say, which I said in my dedicated Lords video, is that I think the art style and general art of Lords, especially within the constraints of the levels that it has, is the biggest win that you can find in it. I truly get excited thinking of what the art team could do with a more unrestrained fantasy setting, because hot damn can it be impressive. So I think these games both really shine here, although I imagine that Lords might be more palatable to most people since it sticks to the tried and true fantasy basis, and people might bounce off the strange puppet-centered mix that Lies of P shows off. I recommend that you don't bounce off it though, because there are some absolutely mesmerizing boss designs and locations here. Another area where I think that both games do a good job are bosses, excluding the mini-bosses from Lords and strictly speaking about the big unique ones. I do think that Lies of P edges it out on the basis of having tighter controls and better mechanics that are more suited for this type of boss design, and also in the overall difficulty presented. It also has a good final boss instead of whatever Lords of the Fallen tried to do. They are overall harder here, more demanding, and require you to engage with and utilize the tools that the game gives you, forcing players to push themselves more without ever feeling unfair. There's a couple of attacks that can make you call bullshit, but they always have ways of being avoided. It's a very difficult game though, and from what I understand, patches have brought that difficulty down, and by the way, both games allow you to bring an NPC ally to most fights, although the AI in both cases can be dumb as rocks, but P's is even a little bit more bare bones than what's in Lords of the Fallen. But they take away aggro and give you space in that fight, just they don't deal much damage. I think the general evaluation I did of difficulty is the same if you factor in these allies, with P remaining harder just the same. But overall, the bosses are challenging, visually striking, with intricate patterns to learn. If there's any criticism to really have, it's that they don't really stray too far from what Souls games have presented before, except maybe the literal MMA fighter Champion Victor, which is a really cool, although very easy fight. Oh, that reminds me, that's another thing that these games share, by the way. At least on release, as much as Lies of P is overall harder, it has some wild difficulty spikes, with some bosses being one-shot easy and others being 30+ tries hard. I did enjoy slamming my head against them though, and maybe that says more about me than it does the game, but that wasn't the case in Lords, which had bosses that were generally very easy, but the ones that weren't didn't feel hard. They felt unfair or too gimmicky. And yes, I am talking about the Hollow Crow and Lightning and Fire Lady, and yes, the Lightbearer also. Let's put him in there for good measure. But if you want to know more, the full hour-long video is in the description. Lies of P gets many things right, but the one that it does incredibly right is progression. For as much as the game starts slowly, as I said before, once it ramps up, it keeps going harder and harder. The Puppet King could be a worthy final boss, and I'm sure some people would leave satisfied if the game ended there. but it doesn't. It's halfway done in a surprise that caught me off guard and filled me with excitement when I noticed just how much more there was to see. Each boss fight tries to top the previous one, and they frequently do, as you keep barreling down this adventure that never ceases to surprise you and just begs you to keep playing. And there's such a confidence that the game has in itself, even with its difficulty spikes present, that it believes people will keep playing. And I'm sure many people didn't, because it really isn't an easy game, but those who persevered were in for a treat. And it ties this progression in with the narrative I mentioned, with puppets, humans, and ergo, and then the world collapses as you choose your destiny between becoming a real boy or not. I'm not that big on story as a reviewer, mostly because while I'm confident in my ability to deconstruct systems and explain them and criticize them, I'm not that confident about my ability to do so with narratives. And there are so many great creators out there that already break these things down much better than I can. So I'll limit myself to speaking about my opinions here and not on the objective quality of it. I love concepts like fables, which bring fairy tales into the real world, and this interpretation of Pinocchio is strange and out there, but it also carries a lot of love for the original story, and that to me was crucial in my enjoyment. The grander story, the stalkers, the ergo, it's all well done and especially meaningful because of how masterfully it mixes into gameplay, showing you the world there is and the consequences of it changing, making the threats to it all the more real. But in the end, it was always a story about P and Geppetto. For such a simple binary choice, I desperately wanted P to become a real boy and break the strings that bind him, and I found myself lying at every opportunity in order to reach that conclusion. It's a fascinating mix of storytelling that borrows from Software storytelling structure, but less vague and based on existing themes that make it easier to process and get involved in. When you combine the collapse of Krat with the plight of Pinocchio, a perfect storm brews to not only tell, but also play through an adventure that is eminently memorable. When all is said and done, Lies of P is the best of the genre not made by its original creators. It's maybe a bit more than that, even. It's a game that can proudly stand on its own 2 feet. It still contains the beating heart of a From Software game, but just enough has changed to be proud of its own merits, including the impeccable job done in stealing exactly what needed to be stolen. The final result is a game that is just incredibly fun to play. It can be a little bit too difficult, and I imagine that some people will just not be able to clear it. But it also offers a wealth of options and tools for the player to engage in. A lot of those tools are those that I mentioned that do not change the core of the game, but add so many layers on top of it that make it feel original. While you don't need any of those tools to really clear the game, some will make the experience easier, and some are there for the players that truly know how to play these games to express their mastery and show off while they do so. The long linear structure that the game has can be seen as a negative, but it can also be seen as a game that's somewhere between 30 to 40 hours long with no filler. There is no hours spent exploring different areas and goofing around. This is just one mainline trek of absolute greatest hit after another, and it keeps the player engaged all the way through with all of these fantastic mechanics that make it such a joy to play. It is really an experience that has left me floored, and I think more people should play this game. I think the thing that most impresses me overall is that to reach a game that is designed in this way, the developers must have studied everything about this genre from top to bottom and made very important decisions that lead to this game. The only criticism I can truly throw at the game is that it doesn't stray far enough, and it sometimes feels like it doesn't trust its innovations enough to make them a bigger part of the experience. But thankfully, the game we have today is not only exceptional in its own right, but if it's a sign of things to come, I couldn't be more excited. I won't spoil what the game hints at next for this world, but I genuinely can't wait. The direction is exactly what I want in a continuation, and if this is what Round 8 Studios can pull off on their first attempt in the genre, I get this chill down my spine thinking about what they could do on their second. The one thing that Lords of the Fallen shouldn't do is follow in Pinocchio's footsteps. Each of these games deserve praise and criticism for different things, and while Lies of P is clearly the superior game, I don't want to discard the interesting ideas and overall direction present in Lords, and I truly wish them the best. But Lies of P will probably hold a special place in my heart for a while. I think that when this game was announced and when we saw it, we thought that P was faking it till he made it, but it turns out he was telling the truth the whole time. Thank you so much for watching, especially those of you who made it until the very end. This has been my biggest video to date. It had an absolutely ridiculous amount of hours put into the script and editing, but I think it was worth it in the end. If you're new here, remember to like and subscribe, especially if you want to see more things like this. And for the regulars, I know some of you are expecting it. Leave a comment below and sneak in "my heart is" or "was pounding," whatever you prefer, and I will heart every comment that sneaks that in there. We're almost at 10,000 subscribers, and I couldn't be more humbled or more thankful that anybody cares what I have to say about games, but we're gonna keep it going. Thank you once again so much for watching. I've been Mugthief, and I'll see you very soon.